Members of Parliament, support staff, radio listeners, TV viewers, all following this meeting through the different social media. Members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And welcome to the continuation of this Central Committee meeting. This is Central Committee meeting number 12 for today, Monday, February the 9th. At this time, I want to give a special word of welcome to the Minister of Public Housing, Spatial Planning, Environment and Infrastructure, VROMI, Mr. Patrice Gums, and his support staff. We have established a quorum of 8 members. I invite you to stand for a moment of silence. Thank you. I have received notice of absence from the member Kotai, Roseburg, and York. So those 3 members are absent, have given notification of their absence from this meeting. I don't have any notifications of lateness. I ask if the floor has any notifications. Any member? Yes, I see MP Duran requesting the floor for notifications. I give you the floor, MP Duran.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Good afternoon to you, my colleagues, the Honorable Minister, his support staff, and a special good afternoon to the people of St. Maarten. Madam Chair, ironically, we were just in a discussion talking about GB in terms of the ad hoc committee. I highlighted the fact that I wrote a letter back in 2024. And lo and behold, as I look in my phone, I saw that the Herald put out an article indicating the fact that the first set of container generators that arrived on the island in 2024 to aid GB in terms of the power grid, in terms of the additional 10 megawatts, are no longer there, and they will be sent to Colombia. So the contract was ended. So my concern remains very valid in terms of how are we moving forward, because here we have the Minister of Vrommy in front of us, Madam Chair, that is signing building permits for big projects, small projects, medium projects. We're losing 10 megawatts, yet there's no clear indication as to when the generators that the Prime Minister promised the people almost 2 years ago will be even ordered. And we don't even have a budget amendment yet either for 2025. Madam Chair, I'm saying all that to say that it's very concerning. I know that the meeting that we had to have with GB with a closed door was postponed time and time again. It's scheduled for this week. Hopefully it goes ahead. But my highlight is to the Minister of Vrommy as to how are you going to continue now supplying or signing and continuing everything as if there's business as usual while we're losing power on the grid. Also, Madam Chair, lastly, I remember a couple of weeks ago the minister was here and he was very adamant that he has no pending meetings. I have a list of at least 4 pending meetings here with the Minister of Vrommy, and I would like to know through you, when will we be getting a response on when those meetings could take place? Thank you very much, because it seems like the minister only comes to discuss what he wants to discuss when he wants to discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Duran. I now give the floor for notifications to MP Otley. MP Otley, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, my notification was mainly on the same note. It is to find out what indeed is the plan. Last we heard from the Honorable Prime Minister was that the RFP had not even started to go out. So if we can definitely know an update on that. I see we have the Minister of Vrommy here, who's also a part of GB, or supposed to be a part of GB. And it's a bit alarming because, for instance, yesterday, engine 17 was down. It's back online. Engine 15 is still down. And last week, engine 19 was down. So therefore, we definitely are not stable. So it would behoove me to receive a clear plan moving forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Otley. I see MP Janssen requesting the floor. MP Janssen, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, and good afternoon to my colleagues, and welcome to the Minister of Vrommy. I took note, as many others, of the removal of the people who were on government land on Palm Island. I have been asking the Minister now for, I think, more than a year, also about a well that's in the Sakers Gut area, which is where I live and where my neighbors used to use the well, especially right after a hurricane. That's where they would access the well. That well has also been taken up by private citizens or by a company. I would like to ask the minister now on the floor of Parliament if he can look into returning the well back to the people. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Janssen. I see that MP Lewis is requesting the floor for notifications. MP Lewis, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Good afternoon to the Minister and his support staff. Good afternoon to my colleagues here. And good afternoon to the people of St. Martin. Yes, I've also taken note with regards to the Minister's decision to execute on Pan Island. But I would also like to know, to you, Madam Chair, if the Ministers have his team outside there, because St. Martin is becoming a dump in itself. And I am not the Minister of Romy, but I receive many calls, many pictures, many information, and I would like to know if the Minister can have his people out there taking note of the areas that needs to be fixed, and tell me, Minister, if you run out of money as well, because my new brand Jeep fall in a serious pothole, and I would like to know what you're doing with it, because I'm not seeing any work going on when it comes to road work recently. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Lewis. MP Iran, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to the Minister and his support staff. Madam Chair, I've heard a lot of comments and complaints and suggestions to the Minister today. But what I would like the Minister to do and his SG and staff is to actually answer emails and messages from the citizens of St. Martin. I think that's one of the main complaints that I've gotten, even in my personal experience. So we could send all these complaints, but there needs to be some type of service. Persons on one end just want to know that a human being is responding on the other end. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Irian. There are no more notifications at this point in time, so I just want to make mention of the fact I can understand the temptation to, in the presence of the minister, to actually ask questions during notifications. However, as I always do, I would ask the relative minister if he or she, whoever it is, if they can respond to a matter raised in notifications, to do so. However, it is not a norm that the minister would respond to notifications. But I would always ask if the minister is in a position to respond to queries. Some of the notifications are now taken on as if they're a question, and especially again, in the presence of the minister, if the minister can respond to them, but if they can, then we cannot make that the notifications must be answered to. That's the point I wanted to make. But with that said, again, up to the minister if he can, I would encourage him to do so. But we continue with the agenda point for this meeting. That is the Nature Policy Plan for St. Martin 2025-2029. Members, this is document number IS-365 of the parliamentary year 25-26, and it is dated the 18th of November of last year. I want to make note of the fact that it's actually the Nature Policy Plan that we receive is the Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030. Going over to the agenda point itself, I mentioned it is registered on the IS number 365. It was received on November the 18th of 2025. This Nature Policy Plan, St. Martin 2025-2030, was submitted to Parliament in accordance with Article 2 of the National Ordinance on the Foundations of Nature Management and Protection. This article in that ordinance states, and I quote, "Once every 5 years, the minister establishes a national nature policy plan in which the international obligations entered into in this regard are also implemented." 2, the Nature Policy Plan requires the approval of Parliament. 3, the Nature Policy Plan will in any case contain A, the objectives regarding nature and the landscape that must be achieved during the planning period. B, an overview of priorities in the field of nature and the landscape that need to be addressed within the planning period. 3, so C, the nature conservation values to be taken into account when implementing the policy. D, a list of national parks, both terrestrial and marine, which consist of natural parks established by national decree containing general measures. 4 of this national ordinance, when drawing up the nature policy plan, the minister takes the spatial development plans into account. 5, the nature policy plan serves as a general framework for nature policy. 6, every year before September the 1st, the minister reports to Parliament on the status of the implementation of the nature policy plan. All members are in possession of a copy of the nature policy plan, and it can also be found on the general team of Parliament. This meeting, the meeting on the National Nature Policy Plan, started on January the 16th of this year, with the Minister of Public Housing, Spatial Development, Environment and Infrastructure giving the Central Committee a presentation explaining the Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030. Members of Parliament were thereafter given the opportunity to pose questions related to the Nature Policy Plan, and the meeting was then adjourned to allow the Minister to have sufficient time to prepare the answers to the questions. So at this time, I give the floor to the Minister of Public Housing, Spatial Planning, Environment and Infrastructure, Mr. Patrice Gomes Jr., to answer the questions posed by members of Parliament. Minister Gomes, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Lady, members of Parliament, those listening and viewing via various means. If you permit me, Madam Chair, I'd like to respond to some of the questions and queries raised at the end of the discussion, if that's possible. And then with that, I'd go directly into the questions at hand. In reviewing the questions raised by Parliament, it is clear that there is a strong interest in how nature protection is translated into day-to-day government decisions, particularly in relation to permitting, zoning, enforcement, financing, and accountability. Many of the questions, and we received 154 of them, reflect legitimate concerns about development pressure, enforcement, capacity constraints, and the long-term protection of sensitive natural areas. At the same time, the questions also reveal a recurring misunderstanding about the function and legal role of the Nature Policy Plan itself, which I'd like to take a moment to clear up before I dive into answering the questions. The Nature Policy Plan Sint Maarten 2025-2030 is not a zoning plan, a permitting instrument, or an enforcement regulation. It does not designate individual parcels as protected land, approve or deny developments, nor impose new fines or permit requirements. Instead, it serves as a strategic policy framework that sets national direction for how nature and biodiversity are to be systematically integrated into spatial planning, developmental decision-making, legislation, financing, and institutional practices over the next 5 years. The Nature Policy Plan's purpose is to move nature considerations upstream, away from ad hoc case-by-case reactions, by clearly defining policy objectives, responsibilities, planned actions, timelines, and performance indicators. In doing so, it creates the foundation upon which concrete instruments such as zoning plans, environmental legislation, permitting procedures, enforcement mechanisms, and budget allocations can be strengthened, aligned, and implemented in a legally sound and transparent manner. Many of the issues raised by Parliament, such as enforcement consistency, mandatory environmental impact assessments, IEAs, green zoning, compensation mechanisms, and structural financing, are therefore not absent from the policy, but are deliberately addressed through phased actions, enabling conditions and institutional reforms outlined in Nature Policy Plan and its accompanying Nature Plan Annex and Appendix 1. This document should therefore be read as an implementation roadmap, one that acknowledges existing limitations, builds on lessons learned from previous policy periods, and once approved, will provide the policy mandate necessary to improve how developments and nature protection are balanced in practice. Its effectiveness will ultimately depend not only on adoption, but on sustained political support, adequate resourcing, interministerial coordination, and continued parliamentary oversight throughout the period. I now go into the first set of questions, the first of them being from MP Janssen Webster. What is currently being done to enforce nature protection, particularly given staff turnover within VROMI? From a policy perspective, we are working to ensure that nature laws and policies are comprehensively considered throughout the decisions and actions of the ministry. The Inspection Department is presently dealing with land-based environmental issues related to the violation of the Hindrance Ordinance, Article 1. This article reads as follows. It is prohibited to erect establishments that may cause danger, damage, or nuisance, or create a nuisance without a permit, which, subject to the exceptions made by a pursuant to this national ordinance, is given by the Minister of VROMI. Paragraph 2. The establishments referred to in the previous paragraph are designated by national decree containing general measures. The Inspection Department also deals with wastewater issues. However, the lack of required materials prevents any other controls when it comes to water bodies. We appreciate the suggestion that at least 2 VROMI inspectors should be fully trained and dedicated to nature and environment. The Nature Policy Plan does say that by 2028, at least 1 VROMI inspector should be fully trained and dedicated to nature and environment. As such, we do not think it's necessary to change the wording of this output indicator at this moment. We will take the consideration up in our planning. Question number 2. How many VROMI staff members are currently being trained for enforcement, and how is continuity knowledge transfer ensured? The Inspection Department is working to ensure that all inspectors have necessary enforcement capacity to carry out their duties. At this moment, the ministry has engaged with a company to have 8 employees, inspectors, trained for BAFPOL/BOA licensing. Question 3. What is the current status of the protected staghorn coral in Kebe Indigo area? Has an assessment been conducted to determine whether this protected coral species still exists following recent development activities in the area? The protected coral species, commonly referred to as elkhorn coral and often locally referred to as staghorn coral in the Indigo Bay area, has been systematically monitored by the Nature Foundation since July 2024. According to a recent monitoring report submitted to the ministry by the Nature Foundation, 10 living staghorn coral colonies were selected and monitored over time. By 2026, only 5 of the original 10 colonies, 50%, remain alive, and of those, only 2 retained more than 80% living tissue. The monitoring shows a statistically significant decline in coral health, with high mortality, tissue loss, and fragmentation documented. In parallel, we are currently reviewing an environmental impact assessment, which was formally requested from the developers by the ministry, precisely because of the known sensitivity of the marine environment, including the presence of these protected coral species. While the Nature Foundation's monitoring data indicates serious ecological stress, their report does not attribute causality to a single source. The EIA process is therefore being used to assess potential impacts, cumulative pressures, and appropriate mitigation measures before further development decisions are taken. This reflects a precautionary and evidence-based approach to balancing development and environmental protection, which our ministry aims to uphold for all developmental decisions. Question 4. What measures are being put in place to ensure that tourism development in Indigo Bay properly take nature protection into account? Speaking more generally, tourism developments must comply with all national permitting requirements, which in this case typically includes building and civil works permits, and occasionally also hindrance permits depending on the facilities on site. On the request of the ministry, the Nature Foundation can be called upon to conduct an initial environmental rapid assessment of development activities in question, and if deemed necessary by the ministry, these developers can be further requested to conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment to ensure that all aspects of nature protection are being considered prior to permitting. There are a few legal avenues by which the Minister of VROMI can request an EIA. In the case of building permits, Article 20 of the Building Ordinance, the applicant is obliged to provide the Minister with all additional information requested by the Minister. Additionally, in the case of civil works permits, Article 28A of the zoning ordinance itself states that the minister will assess the application, taking into account the reasonably expected future developments of the surrounding area, and that he or she can withhold permission if the plan activities from the perspective of general interest will raise serious concerns and appeal because of the potential irreparable harm to the environment. To do a proper assessment, the minister can require the applicant to submit extra information, being an EIA. Now, speaking more specifically about the situation in Indigo Bay, as I mentioned in my answer to the previous question, developers have been requested to conduct a full-scale EIA. The Ministry of ROMI, together with a team of currently reviewing the assessment to determine whether the proposed developments adequately address nature protection requirements, whether mitigation measures are necessary, or whether the development should be permitted to continue as is. Moving to the questions now of MP Duran. What key principles or approaches from the previous nature policy framework have been carried over by the ministry in this current one? Stated in the presentation of January 16th, a large portion of the previous nature policy plan was carried over, updated Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030. This includes 9 overarching policy objectives, as well as the vision and guiding principles for the policy. I explained during the presentation, this is because there are a number of policy objectives which were not fully implemented during the previous planning period, or that we were still in implementation, so they have been carried over for this new period. Furthermore, the Global Biodiversity Framework, which guides the nature policy development globally, being the previous Aichi, Biodiversity, and now the Global Diversity Framework, follow a 10-year timeline. Therefore, the global diversity targets which were relevant during the previous policy are still relevant for this upcoming cycle. Question number 2. Can you highlight those continuing principles or outline the differences so it's clear what has changed and what has remained the same? The guiding principles which have remained the same are 1. The integration of nature and development. 2. The precautionary principle. 3. Collective responsibility. And 4. One island approach. And of course, you can see page 23 and 24 of the Nature Policy Plan for a full description of these guiding principles. The main changes, as stated in the presentation of the Nature Policy Plan to the previous one, include the following. The Nature Policy Plan and the Nature Plan have been merged into one document. An additional Chapter 4 on ensuring effective implementation was created. Some goals within the different policy objectives have also been reorganized for clarity. And finally, styles of some goals have been updated in lines to reflect what was achieved during the implementation of the previous Nature Policy Plan, and some goals, approximately 7, have been added to further align with the Global Diversity Framework, GBF. I will very quickly go through a table which will be shared with the parliamentary members when they receive the answers in writing. The Table 1 outlines these additional goals, which include reducing pollution. By 2028, ensure that principles to reduce the negative pollution are fully integrated into national policy. 2, nature-positive agriculture. By 2028, ensure that the nature-positive farming techniques and reduced use of harmful chemicals are fully integrated into national agricultural policy. 3, removing harmful subsidies. By 2028, harmful subsidies and incentives are identified, and efforts are made to reduce them. 4, strengthen civil works permitting processes. By 2027, strengthen procedure for civil works permits. Following this, strengthen hindrance permitting process. 2027, strengthen procedure for hindrance permits. Equitable benefits. By 2028, ensure that local communities benefit equitably from St. Martin's natural areas. And finally, increase cooperation within the kingdom. By 2025, there is an established cooperation structure within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the preservation and management of natural resources, food security, knowledge exchange, and international treaties. MP Duran's third question. In practical terms, when a permit application is reviewed today, what are the main environmental factors that you personally focus on before a decision is made? In practical terms, when reviewing a permit application involving civil works or spatial development, the main environmental factors I focus on are on the potential impact on natural habitats, biodiversity and protected species, water systems, and long-term land use and spatial planning. Activities such as terrain excavation, leveling, road construction, vegetation clearance, and water management modifications can have significant and sometimes irreversible effects on the natural environment. For that reason, these types of works require a civil works permit under Article 28A of the National Ordinance on Spatial Development Planning. and they are evaluated following the standard procedures outlined in a recently published Civil Works Permitting Procedure Manual. A key consideration, the proposed development affects areas of ecological importance or sensitive ecosystems. For the case of civil works permits, these areas are outlined in section 4.31, Environmental Rapid Assessment via Nature Foundation, Civil Works Permitting Procedure Manual. If the civil works or spatial development in question, just close the questions. If the civil works or spatial development in question impacts the areas outlined in this section, the Nature Foundation may be asked to conduct an environmental rapid assessment, provide technical advice. Where impacts may be substantial, a more comprehensive EIA can be required to ensure that environmental risks are fully understood and that mitigation measures are built into the project design. The EIA is typically requested if the environmental rapid assessment from the Nature Foundation indicates that a more thorough analysis is needed to understand the impacts to the environment, or if the internal review process of the ministry reveals that a more thorough assessment is needed for sound decision-making. An important factor is the potential impact on protected native species. Under Article 8A of the Nature Ordinance, native species listed under the SPA Protection Protocol Annex 1 and 2 are protected, and developments must avoid harming these species to their habitats. Typically, the environmental rapid assessment from the Nature Foundation will identify the presence of these species and comment on potential impacts of the proposed civil works development. Meanwhile, EIAs are expected to assess these risks and more comprehensively inform decision-making. Exemptions against the protected species are only possible under very limited circumstances and require a formal scientific and technical review process through the SPA protocol. Overall, the focus is on preventing irreversible environmental damage, ensuring that biodiversity and ecosystem functions are safeguarded, and that development proceeds in a way that is consistent with the country's long-term environmental and spatial planning objectives. Question 4. How does the ministry handle developmental pressures across different districts, knowing that some areas can accommodate more development than others? The ministry follows the regulations set forth in the draft zoning plans and the hillside policy, which typically already take the available developmental space into account across the different districts. The beach policy and the parking policy are also used to guide new developments and limit pressure on public spaces. The hillside policy aims to reduce building density higher in the hills, 50 to 100 meters medium density, 50 to 200 meters low density, and 100 meters in vicinity of ridges, and on steep slopes, no building is allowed. The beach policy aims to preserve the beaches and keep construction at a safe distance from the sea. The parking policy aims to keep the parking requirements on the lots to prevent crowdedness along the streets. The draft zoning plans contain specific building density and height requirements in specific zones. A typical, normal, quiet residential area will usually allow a maximum density of 40% and 2 to 3 levels on the lot, whereas areas identified as centers allow for more density up to from 50 to 80% and 12 to 15 meters building heights, such as in Phillipsburg and along the Simpson Bay Road entertainment area. The same goes for areas identified as recreation, stayover recreation. Lastly, areas zoned for nature do not allow any construction. Lastly, where we think that a development may have a negative impact and place too much pressure on the natural environment, no matter in what zone it is proposed, we consult the Nature Foundation to carry out an environmental rapid assessment before we make a decision. The ministry is working to update the current draft zoning to reflect the growing pressure on infrastructure, but will require close collaboration with the different ministries in this regard. How does the ministry assess the overall impact in areas where development has occurred gradually over many years? The ministry hasn't done comprehensive impact assessments of possibly overdeveloped areas. The government of St. Maarten is currently undertaking various studies addressing, among other things, current inventory and capacity limitations. This will help assess how rapid development has changed our environment over time and how much more development our island can still take while still maintaining a good quality of life for our citizens. On a case-by-case basis, when handling permit requests, especially in environmentally sensitive areas such as hillsides or already dense neighborhoods, the ministry will assess the surrounding areas first to see if the proposed new developments can potentially cause hindrance or nuisance to the environment based on Article 22, Sub 5 of the Building Ordinance. We do this based on the hillside policy, beach policy, the draft zoning plans, and the parking policy. Where deemed necessary by requesting the developer to conduct an environmental impact assessment in accordance with the legal framework previously outlined. Question 6. Which of the areas identified for conservation is your ministry most focused on protecting at this time? And what makes those areas a priority based on professional assessments or studies that were conducted? The ministry is currently focused on finalizing the work to protect Little Key Island in the Simpson Bay Lagoon. We are currently working on hiring legal assistance for the review and revision of the nature ordinance, to ensure that nature parks can be established in a clear and legally defensible manner. Appendix 5 of the Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030 also puts forward a map of the areas considered important for conservation. This includes areas recognized as important for conservation based on a number of national policies, specifically the hillside policy, hilltops over 200 meters and within 50 meters from the ridge, the beach policy, the draft zoning development plans, but also areas identified as important for conservation based on a number of professional assessments and studies that were conducted throughout the years. This includes important bird areas, IBAs, and key biodiversity areas, KBAs, which are internationally recognized, following national designation by a committee of national experts. Many of these areas were also formally identified in the studies commissioned by the ministry in the 1990s, with the purpose of informing the development and draft zoning development plans, being the following studies: Ecovision 1995, the ponds of Sint Maarten; Aid Environment and Ecovision 1995, the marine environment of Sint Maarten; and finally, Aid Environment and Ecovision 1926, zoning plan for the hillside area of Sint Maarten. Is the minister currently considering any additional areas that may require formal protection or designation as green or conservation zones? In December 2025, the ministry presented a preliminary plan for protection of coastal and ecologically sensitive areas to Parliament, which includes all potential natural areas to preserve or protect. The zones included in the preliminary map are based on the draft zoning plans from 2014. When we finish the aforementioned legislation, other areas can be added. This includes further enhanced protection of the already protected Mullet Pond and areas currently under internal review for terrestrial conservation. How does the ministry determine when an area requires stronger protection beyond general policy guidelines? Beyond the general policy guidelines and protections outlined in laws such as Nature Ordinance, already described in response to the earlier question, this is question 3, the ministry may determine that an area requires stronger protection if there's evidence to suggest that the proposed activity will disfigure the surroundings or would be a nuisance or a fire hazard to the surroundings. How do you balance the need for housing with responsibility to protect nature when both pressures exist side by side? Indeed, both pressures exist side by side, and balancing them is the very essence of sustainable development and the responsibility of the Minister of Romy. So I tend to disagree with the need to separate spatial planning development from environmental protection. It would defeat the purpose of having an island abundant in housing opportunities, yet completely unlivable as a consequence. To work towards this sustainable development of Sint Maarten, we follow the principles mentioned in responses to question 4. Particularly in zoning plans, there are designated areas for residential purposes, which allow for construction of homes. Even in center zones, areas where residential housing is allowed, given that it's usually additional to commercial establishments. For example, apartments located above stores. In areas zoned for nature, we prohibit construction and focus on the enhancement, preservation, and protection of the natural environment. How does the ministry determine when a hillside area is becoming too heavily built up, even if the land is privately owned and proposed projects meet the formal requirements? Whether or not land is privately owned, the guidelines of the hillside policy and the draft development zoning plans are followed when deciding on developments in the hillsides. If the proposed development meets formal requirements but may be considered too dense or potentially harmful to the surrounding area, based on the pre-existing situation, then we may request the developer to conduct a comprehensive EIA so that we can objectively make a decision on the development or any potential adjustments that could be made to the design to ensure that any negative impacts are not felt downhill, in particular in low-lying areas downhill. This request for an EIA can be supported through Article 20 of the Building Ordinance, which states that the applicant is obliged to provide the minister with all additional information requested by the minister. Question 11. Is the government considering any form of reimbursement or land swaps in such cases? In the past, the ministry has generally operated by allowing things to happen and hoping for the best. However, under our current administration, we are working to take a more proactive approach, and indeed reimbursements or land swaps may be a viable option that we are willing to explore in the future. I will also add that under Policy Objective 8 of the Nature Policy 2025-2030, we have proposed establishing a compensation framework for situations when damage to the natural environment are considered unavoidable, yet the development in question is essential to national well-being. Question 12. I'd like to understand the ministry's thinking in cases where someone applies for a building permit, but based on the location is not permitted. How does the ministry proceed in those circumstances? In these instances, it is likely that the building permit application that was submitted was not permitted according to the established laws and policies. To combat these issues in the future, we are working towards greater alignment with VROMI and Cadastre to support the sharing of information, including the draft zoning plans and land use policies. This collaboration will also include tools such as single source map of the relevant areas of the draft zoning plans and policies where building is restricted. This, of course, links to the effect indicator 6.1.1 in the nature policy. By 2027, there's an improved collection and public accessibility of geospatial data of natural values for planning and decision-making. Question 13. How does the ministry take visual impact into account, such as buildings on high points when reviewing developmental proposals? The ministry takes visual impacts on higher altitudes into account through the hillside policy, namely by restricting developments in areas that are visually sensitive or prominent in the hillsides. In particular, buildings are prohibited above the 200-meter altitude line, which covers hilltops and high points that form the island skyline and are reserved mainly for conservation. In addition, construction is not allowed on very steep slopes over 40 degrees or within 50 meters of primary hill ridges. That is 50 meters vertically measured below a ridge or hilltop. Because buildings in these locations would be highly visible and visually disturbing. Ridge lines that shape the skyline are generally considered no-build areas, specifically for visual and aesthetic reasons. By applying the altitude, slope, and ridge protection guidelines as outlined in the hillside policy, the ministry aims to prevent developments from negatively impacting the island's natural visual character. Question 14, which types of developments or which areas are currently receiving the most attention in terms of inspection and compliance? Due to limited staffing capacity, the inspection department is currently prioritizing activities where oversight is most urgent and where risk to public safety, environmental quality, and regulatory compliance are highest. These include assisting to alleviate the existing backlog within the permits department and responding to complaints related to ongoing construction and land use activities. As a result, inspections are largely focused on active developments where works are already underway and where non-compliance could lead to immediate or irreversible impacts. This risk-based prioritization allows the department to make the most effective use of available capacity while maintaining oversight of developments with the greatest potential impact. How does the ministry weigh economic benefits against environmental protection when those interests come into conflict? As outlined during the presentation, the vision of the Nature Policy Plan is to promote a shift in perspective, from viewing nature conservation as a constraint on development to recognizing nature as an essential economic asset for sustainable development of Sint Maarten. In practice, this means that economic benefits and environmental protections are weighed using evidence-based tools rather than treated as competing interests. One of the policy's output indicators, 2.1.3, is that by 2027, additional economic valuations of Sint Maarten's natural resources will be carried out. These valuations assess the ecosystem services provided by nature, such as coastal protection, tourism value, and climate resilience, allowing the ministry to evaluate whether a proposed development contributes to long-term economic benefit or undermines it by degrading essential natural assets. This approach is reinforced under Policy Objective 6 of the Nature Policy Plan, which focuses on integrating nature and biodiversity into spatial planning and developmental strategies. Through working to make EIAs mandatory for select development activities and strengthening planning procedures, development proposals will be assessed for environmental risks, cumulative impacts, and mitigation options before decisions are taken. Where conflicts arise, decisions are guided by established policies and spatial planning instruments rather than ad hoc judgment. This, of course, links to Output Indicator 6.1.3, which states by 2028, EIAs are made mandatory for select development activities to minimize the loss of biodiversity in spatial developments. Question 16. How are those decisions handled in practice, and can examples be provided? For large developments that, even though potentially beneficial to the economy, may also pose a threat to the natural environment, the ministry will require EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment. Examples where this has been done are for developments proposed in K Bay, Indigo, along Little Bay Pond. Typically, the EIA should include the economic, social, and environmental impacts the development will have on the surrounding area, and it should include measures that need to be taken to prevent or mitigate negative impacts on the environment. Question 17. By the end of the planning period, what clear or visible changes should the people of St. Maarten expect to see if the balance between development and environmental protection is being properly managed? In other words, what is the end goal of this trajectory for the perspective of the public? Very good question. By the end of the 5-year planning period, the public should not expect every environmental or development challenge to be fully resolved. But they should expect to see clear, visible signs that St. Maarten is moving in the right direction and that development is better managed. If the balance between the development and environmental protection is being properly addressed, the island should begin to look healthier, function more efficiently, and feel more livable. Public spaces and beaches should be cleaner and better maintained, erosion pressures more actively managed, and sensitive areas such as ponds, mangroves, and hillsides more consistently protected from damage. Development should appear more organized and resilient, with greater attention to natural drainage, slope stability, and runoff management, resulting in fewer flooding issues and less sediment entering coastal waters. The public should also see stronger signals of enforcement and compliance, and improved coordination between planning and environmental oversight. While not all high-value natural areas will be formally designated within this period, progress should be visible through improved protection measures, clearer planning rules, and the groundwork being laid for future nature parks and conservation areas. Neighborhoods should increasingly benefit from shade and green spaces. In short, the public should experience a country that continues to develop economically while becoming more resilient, more orderly, and more comfortable to live in. This 5-year policy period is about setting that trajectory, embedding sustainable development as the standard rather than the exception. As has been emphasized throughout, the ministry and the Nature Policy Plan are not opposed to development. The objective is sustainable development, integrating nature into planning and construction practices so that economic growth strengthens rather than undermines long-term quality of life. As we stated on several occasions, the ministry, and by extension, the Nature Policy Plan, are not against development, but aim to work towards sustainable development, integrating nature into developmental practices. Question 18. How many civil works permits were requested and how many were issued over the past year, month by month? And we begin. January 2025, total requested 0, total issued 0. February, total requested 4, total issued 1. March, total requested 4, total issued 1. April, April, total requested 11, total issued 6. May, total requested 5, total issued 1. June, total requested 3, total issued 0. July, total requested 9, total issued 6. August, total requested 4, total issued 0. September, total issued 5, total issued 0. October, total requested 9, total issued 0. November, total requested 19, total issued 3, for a total of 73 civil works permits requested and 18 issued. 19, is the process still handled on a case-by-case basis, which some may perceive as favoritism, or is it now mandatory to have everyone comply before any groundbreaking takes place? Important to consider is that civil works permits were introduced by law in 2021. Civil works permits are mandatory and required for activities which include substantial interventions such as terrain excavation, leveling, road construction, vegetation clearance, and water management modifications, which have the potential to cause significant and often irreversible impacts on the environment and land use. The newly published Civil Works Permit Procedure Manual details the specific conditions of these activities which would trigger the requirements for civil works permit. This manual has been recently published in the National Gazette and on the government website. The ministry is currently developing a second, more lenient version of the manual aimed in particular at civil works with limited or no significant impact. These lower impact activities may be eligible for expedited permitting process compared to activities with significant impact. The ministry is also in the process of hiring, within short, 8 persons to have more capacity to be able to address the additional workloads and working on the building permits, including civil works permits and the backlog. The questions from MP York. How does this policy practically resolve conflicts between development and nature, and what guarantees better outcomes than the current system? This nature policy plan sets out how policy objectives will be carried out in practice, including responsibilities, actions, timelines, budgets, and performance indicators for the next 5 years, so that nature considerations are systematically built into government decision-making. While the plan itself is not a permitting tool, it puts forward the framework of planned actions for the coming 5 years of how we plan to better integrate nature and biodiversity into spatial planning and developmental processes, helping to prevent and more effectively manage conflicts between development and environment over time. As such, this policy, the Nature Policy Plan, aims to improve how conflicts between development and nature are handled by moving nature consideration upstream into planning and decision-making, rather than treating them as afterthoughts. MP York's second question. Are there any areas on the island where development will be refused, and if so, where? If development is not refused anywhere, what exactly is protected under the policy, including the referenced 30% targets? The Nature Policy Plan itself does not designate no development areas. It does provide a map of areas of conservation of importance. Appendix 5. Land use decisions and development approvals are made through spatial planning, zoning, and permitting processes. What the Nature Policy Plan does is set out the steps to be taken to strengthen how nature and biodiversity will be more comprehensively factored into those permitting decisions. By identifying sensitive ecosystems such as wetlands, mangroves, hillsides, and coastal zones as nationally important for resilience and well-being, and working towards their protection, the policy supports stricter conditions, better planning, which in some cases may lead to refusal developments that would cause unacceptable environmental damage. The referenced 30% targets relate to St. Maarten's commitment to increase conservation and effective management of marine and coastal areas in line with the international biodiversity goals, which St. Maarten must implement as we are part to these conventions. This does not mean locking away 30% of land from all use, but ensuring that key natural areas are sustainably managed so they continue to provide protection, food, tourism value, and climate resilience for the country. As this is the policy plan, it only establishes these 30% targets, and then the practical steps of how these policy objectives will be implemented, including who is responsible, what actions will be taken, and when they will happen, including timelines, budgets, key stakeholders, and performance targets for the upcoming 5-year period. Question 3. How is climate adaptation, examples hurricanes, flooding, erosion, actually embedded into spatial planning and capital works? Climate adaptation is now somewhat considered in the current policies and laws applied in the permit evaluation process, namely building code and housing ordinance, draft zoning plans, hillside policy, and beach policy. It is recognized by the ministry that climate adaptation needs to be more strongly embedded in our laws. That is why some of these legislation is in the process of and will soon be updated or implemented, such as the zoning plan and the building code, whereby there's a specific focus on integrating climate adaptation into law. Question 4. What changes in how permits are approved starting next month once this planned policy is implemented? The policy itself does not change the process to approve permits. However, some of the actions proposed under this 5-year policy plan will directly impact processes to approve permits, such as the establishment of nature parks, additional laws to protect species, creation and the creation of compensation frameworks, etc. Question 5. What concrete changes introduced by this policy will reduce flooding, erosion, or storm damage during the rainy season? Once again, as it's a nature policy plan, not a drainage or stormwater management policy plan, this policy focuses on ecosystems approach to help reducing flooding, erosion, and storm damage. The policy introduces goals to expand the area of land and sea under protection. Protecting nature and green areas directly reduces flooding by increasing the ground's capacity to absorb, store, and slow down water. Effectively acting as a natural sponge-like matter in the landscape. Yes. Furthermore, actions to protect marine areas such as corals and seagrass beds will directly influence storm damage, as these ecosystems act as a line of natural defense against storm waves. The Nature Policy Plan also introduces the objective to work towards developing an ecosystem-based adaptation EBA plan, which will put forward methods in which nature can be harnessed as a tool to combat and adapt to the impacts of climate change, including flooding, erosion, and storm damage. These, of course, are linked to output indicators 1.3.1, 1.3.2, 1.4.1, 1.4.2, and 9.3.1. If a major hurricane were to occur, what would this policy change in terms of preparation or recovery? The Nature Policy Plan does not function as a disaster management or emergency response plan, so it does not directly change hurricane preparedness or post-disaster recovery protocols. Those responsibilities remain within the disaster risk management, emergency services, and infrastructure planning frameworks. However, the plan does strengthen Sint Maarten's long-term resilience to hurricanes by focusing on building healthier, better managed ecosystems. As such, many of the policy objectives contribute indirectly but meaningfully to reducing hurricane impacts and improving recovery time. First, the document sets out the plans of the coming 5 years for the protection, restoration, and sustainable management of ecosystems such as mangroves, coral reefs, seagrass beds, wetlands, beaches, and hillside vegetation. These natural systems act as natural defense infrastructure. Coral reefs and seagrass beds help reduce wave energy and coastal erosion. Mangroves and wetlands absorb floodwaters and storm surge. And finally, healthy hillside vegetation stabilizes slopes and reduces landslides and sediment runoff during heavy rainfall. By investing in these natural systems, the country reduces physical damage from storms and protects critical infrastructure and communities, which in turn supports faster and less costly recovery. Second, Policy Objective 9 specifically integrates climate change into national planning and promotes ecosystem-based adaptation, EBA. This includes developing key climate impact data, incorporating future climate risks into planning and decision-making, and creating an ecosystem-based adaptation plan. These actions help ensure that nature is deliberately used as a tool to buffer storm impacts rather than being degraded in ways that increases vulnerability. Finally, by reducing other environmental pressures such as habitat loss, pollution, and unsustainable land use, the plan improves overall ecosystem health. Healthy ecosystems recover faster after hurricanes, which helps restore key services like coastal protection, fisheries, tourism value, and water regulation that are essential for social and economic recovery. In short, while the Nature Policy Plan does not replace disaster response plans, it strengthens the island's natural defenses and adaptive capacity. This leads to lower hurricane damage over time and more resilient recovery, especially in coastal and flood-prone areas. Question number 7. What concrete agreements exist with the front side to jointly enforce nature protection? Policy Objective 7 of the Nature Policy Plan calls for increased local, regional, and international cooperation for nature. Under this general policy objective, PO 7.2 specifically calls for increased cooperation with Sint Maarten for nature. The goal 7.21 for the policy is that by 2027, there are established cooperation structures with Sint Maarten for the preservation and management of nature and environment on the island as a whole. In our presentation to Parliament, we already highlighted some achievements to date, which include MOU between Nature Foundation and the Reserve Naturel, cooperation structures developed by the government, level cooperation between both sides. What changes will apply to people who dump garbage, cut hillsides, or damage mangroves, such as higher fines, more inspections, or faster enforcement? How many environmental fines were issued last year, and how many of these fines were actually collected? Once again, this is a policy plan. Its goal is to outline the practical steps of how the policy itself, objectives itself, will be implemented, who is responsible, what actions will be taken, and when they will happen, including timelines, budgets, and performance targets. As such, the Nature Policy Plan itself does not lay out actions or fines that will apply to people who dump garbage, cut hillsides, or damage mangroves. What it does do is put forward a list of actions to strengthen the legal and institutional framework that will lead to stricter oversight and more consistent enforcement against activities like illegal dumping, cutting hillsides, and damaging mangroves. Through updates to environmental legislation and better integration of nature into spatial planning and permitting, these activities are expected to face clearer rules and stricter conditions before approval. The plan also emphasizes building government enforcement capacity, supporting more inspections, and faster follow-up on violations. Together, these changes mean a higher likelihood that environmental damage will be detected, acted upon, and where necessary, penalized or required to be restored. Issuance of administrative fines for environmental crimes is currently limited by the decree regulating administrative enforcement. The ministry is currently working to have this decree properly implemented with the contracted legal teams. Question number 9. How many inspectors will be added? When will they be added, and what enforcement powers will they have? The Nature Policy Plan does not propose adding additional inspectors to the current formation plan of the ministry. However, it does propose specifically educating inspectors on nature and environment topics and dedicating at least one inspector to nature and environment. This, of course, is linked to Effect Indicator 5.21, which states by 2027, inspectors educated on nature and environment, and by 2028, at least one ROMI inspector is fully trained and dedicated to nature and environment. Question 10. What are the defined responsibilities of other stakeholders involved in implementation, including TEAT, Justice, the Port, or the Coast Guard, and Public Health? The Nature Policy Plan does not contain specific defined responsibilities for stakeholders, but it does outline the stakeholders, key partners that have a role to play in the different proposed activities towards the execution of the policy objectives. This is detailed in the Nature Policy Plan, Appendix 1 of the Nature Policy Plan. It also contains a chapter, 1.9, which details a number of government stakeholders which play a significant role in the protection of the country's natural resources to a varying degree, as well as non-government stakeholders which play a crucial role in facilitating the protection of nature and biodiversity. This chapter also briefly details their roles and responsibilities as it relates to the natural environment. Question 11. What concrete changes on the ground should be expected after this plan is approved? Once again, it's just a policy plan. Its goal is to outline the practical steps of how the policy objectives will be implemented, who is responsible, what actions will be taken, and when they will happen, including timelines, budgets, and performance targets for the upcoming 5 years. As such, once approved, the Nature Policy Plan will not instantly change the landscape, but it intends to set in motion the practical actions that will work to shift how land, coast, and natural areas are managed and protected. On the ground, this means that if the policy is effectively implemented in the 5 years, nature will play a bigger role in planning and development decisions, with more environmental conditions tied to permits and greater attention to sensitive areas like hillsides, wetlands, mangroves, and coastal areas. You can also expect gradual expansion of conservation, restoration, and monitoring efforts, such as protecting and rehabilitating key ecosystems, improving data collection on environmental conditions, and using nature-based solutions like mangroves and reefs to strengthen climate and storm resilience. At the same time, the plan supports stronger legislation, better coordination between the ministries, and increased enforcement and capacity, which together lead to more consistent oversight of activities that damage nature. In short, the most concrete change will be tighter integration of nature into everyday government decisions, more active management of natural and important ecosystems, and a steady shift towards development that works with rather than against St. Martin's natural systems. Question 12. Is this policy primarily driven by international reporting obligations or by a domestic plan to address local environmental problems? This Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030 is equally driven by national and international reporting requirements. As mentioned during our presentation, the national requirement for Nature Policy Plan is a national operationalization regulation to law of the international requirement for a National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, NBSAP, by the Convention on Biological Diversity. As such, both international and national requirements equally motivate the development of this Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030. The Kingdom of the Netherlands in Europe, through its Ministry of LVVN, closely follows the decisions and deadlines of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we are party to as the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And as such, they made available support to help finalize the Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030. So while the support mobilized by the Ministry of LVVN was largely motivated by international requirements, we were also in need of updating our own national nature policy plan. As such, from the perspective of the Ministry of ROMI, this updated Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030 is equally driven by national and international requirements. Question 13, from what day will environmental impact assessments become mandatory and which types of developments will require them? Under policy objective number 6, Nature Integrated Development Strategies, of this Nature Policy Plan, the goal is that by 2028, environmental impact assessments, EIAs, are made mandatory for select development activities to minimize the loss of biodiversity in spatial developments. This is, of course, linked to Effect Indicator 6.13, as previously stated. Question 14. How would Parliament objectively measure success or failure if baseline data is limited? Stated during the presentation, progress has been made towards establishing baseline data during the implementation of the previous Nature Policy Plan. This was done through the execution of the Resembit-funded Corina project, which was executed between 2023 and 2025 through a partnership with the Ministry of ROMI and Nature Foundation. One of the work streams of this project works to collect marine, coastal, and terrestrial baseline data and to develop habitat maps. Furthermore, the Nature Policy Plan does offer effect indicators for each policy objective that can be used to measure progress towards execution of the Nature Policy Plan. Question 15. If annual reports show targets are not being met, what corrective actions are triggered by the policy? The Nature Policy Plan recognizes that its implementation will be complex and challenging. Executing the planned actions requires significant effort and coordination. As such, Chapter 4 of the Nature Policy Plan provides the critical steps for a successful implementation by first establishing the enabling conditions for implementation. As we outlined the presentation to Parliament on January 16th, the four most important enabling conditions are government capacity, which I think we all know. B, sustainable funding and investments, legal changes, and data for implementation. C, shared values to develop in harmony with nature. And D, a strong coordinating structure. In its initial phase, 2025-2027, of implementation, focus of the nature policy will be on advancing these enabling conditions as outlined in Section 4.2. As such, if annual reports show that targets are not being met, then we must first examine the enabling environment to ensure that necessary conditions are met for the successful implementation of the nature policy plan. And if not, then corrective measures to strengthen the enabling environment must first be put into action. Question 16. Where in a written policy is it clearly stated that which areas will be protected or restored under 30% targets, and what happens if those targets are missed? These, I believe, were covered in answers 2 and answers 15. Let me finish this. Madam Chair, I'd like to make a proposal that we finish with all the answers of MP York, and then we just take a short break after. We are on question 17 of 25. So if that's okay with yourself.
Thank you, Minister, for your answers thus far. And yes, I will allow you to continue with the answers to MP York's questions, and that's about, you said we're at 17, and
8 more questions.
We have 8 more questions, and then we'll take a brief adjournment. We will do so. You may continue, Minister.
Thank you. The MP's questions then shifted towards green zoning with his 17th question. What is the current status of the green zoning plan that was presented for implementation 2025-2026? The presentation outlines several critical prerequisites, required for the successful implementation of the project, with the most significant being adequate human capacity and funding. As the ministry did not have a full budget to execute the entire project, the decision was made to first develop a green zoning framework. This framework is now in its finalization phase and is being supported through funding from the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management via the International Panel for Deltas and Coastal Areas, IPDC. This framework identifies climate adaptation measures for each designated zone, ensuring that land use regulations directly contribute to risk reduction and promote sustainable climate resilient development. This includes measures to preserve and protect coastal ecosystems, reduce flood risks, and increase green spaces. Additionally, a coastal erosion study and landslide study were funded under the IPDC as well. The study results will be used as an input for new abated zoning regulations as well. The next phase is to use the zoning plan framework and the preliminary plan map, which was presented earlier as the basis for the comprehensive countrywide zoning plan we have proposed for funding by the TWO through VROMI's country package E7. The proposal for a countrywide zoning map has been submitted to the COM for approval, and VROMI aims to start with this project immediately after the approval of the budget 2026. How far has the minister progressed with the timeline previously presented to Parliament for green zoning? We will finalize the mentioned zoning framework within the next month, and we will continue the countrywide comprehensive zoning planning thereafter. Question 19. Of the 8 initial action points that were supposed to be completed, how many have now been finalized? As mentioned, we took a slightly different approach to this project due to the initial human and financial capacity restraints. However, with the explained approach, we have delivered a coastal erosion and landslide study, and within a short period of time, we'll have the green zoning plan framework, which will be used as the basis for the countrywide zoning plan. Question 20. Has there been any progress since the earlier update where none of the 8 points have been completed? Yes, progress was made through a different approach, as explained in my previous answer. 21. At this point in time, where does the green zoning plan stand within the next phases of internal preparations, public consultations, and legal processes? The mentioned zoning framework will be finalized within the next month. This framework is part of the internal preparation phase. The intention is to have this framework validated through an expert focus group. Additionally, the project also includes 2 community consultations aimed at the cul-de-sac and K-Bay area, which have been identified as high vulnerable areas. Cul-de-sac, as it is flood prone, and K-Bay, as our utilities company's plant is located here. Yet it lies very close to the sea. The zoning framework also results of the coastal erosion and landslide study will be validated through these stakeholder consultations as well. Question 22. Given the timeline indicated the process should be halfway through legal phase by mid-January, has this milestone been reached? No, however, the approach has changed as mentioned earlier. How many of the 23 legal steps identified in the minister's timeline have been completed thus far? No legal steps have been completed thus far, due to the change mentioned earlier. 24, how does the green zoning plan align with or integrate into the current nature policy under discussion? Through the zoning plan, the nature policy can be implemented. The nature policy, for instance, identifies areas that are important for conservation or protection, hillsides, wetlands, mangroves, and ponds. The zoning plan will designate these areas as natural areas to be legally conserved or protected, meaning no construction will be allowed in these areas or stricter building regulations may be required. The zoning plan can further mitigate threats to biodiversity and prevent habitat loss by limiting developments on hillsides, coastal zones, and ponds by posing strict building regulations focused on erosion prevention, creation of buffer zones between areas zoned for development, and areas that include sensitive ecosystems and implement sewage and drainage systems to prevent flooding and reduce runoff impact on marine life, corals and seagrasses. The zoning plans may also include regulations linked to nature restoration or compensation in certain areas and demand EIAs for certain types of developments. The zoning plan ultimately translates the policy goals into legally binding spatial regulations aimed to protect and preserve the natural environment. And finally, the 25th question, can the minister clarify how both the nature policy and green zoning plan are being coordinated, given that they are closely related? The nature policy, among others, serves as the foundation, as explained earlier, for the creation of the zoning plan framework and ultimately the countrywide zoning plan, wherein specific binding regulations will be included aimed at nature and biodiversity conservation and protection in designated areas and zones. With that, Madam Chair, we come to the end of the questions of MP York.
Thank you, Minister Patrice Gums, for those answers thus far. In accordance with your request, I will now adjourn this meeting until 4 p.m. That will give us about 20 minutes adjournment. Meeting adjourned until 4 p.m., 20 minutes exactly. Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this Central Committee meeting of Parliament, in which a presentation regarding the Nature Policy Plan 2025-2030 was made. We had questions from the members of Parliament during that round, so to speak, and the Minister is here today responding to those questions and queries by members of Parliament. However, after caucusing with the Minister, because the Minister still has a good length to go in terms of responding to questions by members of Parliament, and I therefore put to the floor whether the members would agree in receiving all of the answers to questions posed thus far in writing ASAP. In fact, maybe right following this meeting, unless there's some tweaking the minister would have to do. I don't know. But in any case, to receive those answers in writing before we continue with this meeting. That allows all members of Parliament to better digest all of the answers given by the minister before we proceed in another round, although we don't speak of rounds in the Central Committee per se, but nevertheless, in the next part of this meeting. If the members could agree with that, that is the way we would proceed on this topic. However, the minister wanted to respond to one or two things raised, including the one about the meetings, the pending meetings, and maybe one or two other matters. Minister, before I allow you to do that, I give the floor. MP Erin, you have a question, comment, or?
You posed a question to members of Parliament, right? So I was responding to that.
Yes, that's what I asked you.
Yes.
If you have, yes, a question regarding what I stated, or a comment, or a query.
Yes, Madam Chair, I typically wouldn't mind having answers being sent, but again, I don't trust it anymore. We have done this exercise a few times already. We had a Minister of TIAT, we had a transportation meeting. The answers would have been sent in 2 weeks, it ended up being 2 months or longer. So I don't have any faith that the answers will be given. And like I said before, the ministry itself doesn't even answer my emails, so I don't know if I have to get those answers also. So from my position, it would be a no.
I thank you for that comment and response. Any other member of Parliament wishes to comment regarding the proposal that we receive all of the answers? I suspect the minister could give those answers. I'll allow him to answer firstly in terms of when we will be getting the answers in writing. But I'll ask the minister to hold his answer while I give the floor to MP Lewis. MP Lewis, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, the proposal given, I stand by it, because right now, with all them questions, they're answering, he putting me to sleep. So I think we should get everything in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Lewis. I wouldn't comment on the last part of your statement. However, I do wish to state that it's a very technical discussion. And my own view is that, especially for members of the public who are, and I would assume there are many members of the public, the citizens of St. Maarten, who are interested in this topic. However, it would be difficult for them to distill from the answers given the things that they would like to hear. When, what, how, which road, which beach, you know? So again, I want the proposal is on the table, as I mentioned before I give the minister the floor, and I continue with the members of Parliament. I give the floor to MP Doran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As my colleague, MP Arian, stated, in principle, understanding how the ministry works, understanding how government should work, I wouldn't have an issue with it, but the issue I have lines up with his issue. We give government opportunities to respond. You don't get responses. I have so many, I think about 2 letters or so pending with the minister for months. My colleague, MP York, all these things are factual things. So to dovetail a bit on what I mentioned earlier, in regards to getting things across with GB and dealing with the government, it's very difficult to trust the government, not knowing when we're going to get the responses. Secondly, the minister said in here, Madam Chair, on the floor of Parliament, that every building permit request requires a civil work permit. I didn't say the minister said. The minister just mentioned now some numbers, and out of 73 civil work permit requests, 18, and that's why I asked the question about preferential treatment, which wasn't answered. But going back and saying all of this to say, Madam Chair, how are we going to move forward in a transparent way when we can't even get clear responses? So that is my fear. And then my question goes to you, Madam Chair, as the chair of this esteemed House. How will you guarantee that we get the answers? And if so, then I would be willing to entertain something as such, but it hasn't seemed to be the case over the last couple of months, and that gives me a bad taste in my mouth.
Thank you, MP Duran. Before I respond to you, allow me to give the floor to MP Otley. MP Otley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I too don't have an issue with the proposal. However, I'll have to share the sentiments of my colleagues that spoke before me and ask the minister to ensure that the answers are given in a timely fashion. As a matter of fact, I would like for the minister to publicly give us a timeline and definite answer on when we can expect these answers. And also, Madam Chair, while the minister is rounding off, I would like to remind the minister to please, if you can, give us any little update on the GB situation that we just spoke about. You are the Minister of Rummy at the end of the day, through you, Madam Chair, and in the articles of incorporation, it still falls under the Minister of Rummy. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Otley. Again, before I give the minister the floor, I will allow MP Lacruz to take the floor. MP Lacruz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Madam Chair Lady, through you to the Honorable Minister, I don't even see why we would have to wait anything longer than 24 hours for these answers, because the minister is ready to read the answers right now. So I would, even if it's unofficially, if the minister could send them in, that we could start to peruse these answers as soon as possible, then he would be able to send them, through the official route tomorrow. But if we would receive those today while we are here, I would highly appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Well noted, MP Lacruz. I'm sure the minister would not have a problem with that. As I mentioned, the minister have all of the answers to the questions already posed. And in continuing with that, he has another 20 pages approximately to read through. Hence my proposal, as I mentioned. However, good point, MP Lacruz, and noted. And so, Minister, you have heard, and I would like you to address the matter in terms, I agree with MP Lacruz, we should be able to get these answers before nightfall, to use a familiar and colloquial adage. But Minister Patrice Gums, to you the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Parliament. Indeed, the teams are busy now, just tidying up the comments on the side, and we will send those shortly to all members of Parliament. As it relates to the statement about civil works permits, and indeed, the reality is civil works permits have been in place since 2021. And since 2021, there has been no process to actually determine when to apply a civil works permit. The biggest challenge we've had thus far is that...
Members, we're live with this, excuse me,
the biggest...
Minister. Members, we're live. Allow the Minister to continue with his responses, please. Minister, you may continue.
Yeah. The biggest challenge we've had with implementing civil works permits was that when they were implemented in 2021, there was no clear procedure on how to actually implement and require a civil works permit. So from 2021 until 2026, with the publication of now the permit manual, all decisions regarding civil works permits were taken ad hoc, considering different things such as, for example, the implementation, the impact, but there was no clear guideline. In fact, if we go back through a number of the permits given over the course of the last couple of years, reintroduction legally, a number of projects don't have civil works permits. So I think to imply that this favoritism on this side isn't necessarily correct is that we didn't have a basis to actually do it. With the Civil Works Manual, it's now clear what it is, and all building permits from this year going forward are legally required to have them, as was always the case, but now we have supporting procedures to support that. Finally, as it relates to sort of the continuing statements about my absence in Parliament, I want to make it very clear, and I asked this question at the last meeting in January, where the list of questions and list of meetings were proposed that I have seemingly not responded to. And I have the list here of the list of meetings that we received as the government of pending that relate to VROMI, and this was received on January 23rd. There is a VROMI committee meeting to discuss the housing policy, social housing project. For the public's good knowledge that I indicated as already, this is the, this meeting was postponed for several reasons, one of which the work was still ongoing with the consultant. There's a new proposed date pending Parliament's approval for this to now be handled. The other meetings, and I will list them here, the topic, public meeting deliberation with the Minister of ROMI addressing various concerns to the Ministry of ROMI. I have not been officially invited to that meeting. The Central Committee meeting, follow-up discussion with the Minister of ROMI on cemetery capacity. That was called November 26, 2025. I have not been invited to that meeting. The Central Committee meeting on infrastructure strategy, national planning road network, that was convened November 28, 2025. I have not been formally invited to that meeting. And finally, this national flood management and drainage readiness, I have not been invited to that meeting as well. So I think, and that's why I stated in the meeting last time, can we have clarity on if this has been invited? Because in essence, a request from a member of parliament to have a meeting does not automatically equate an invitation coming to the minister. For the good grace of the members, there is a manner in which this House convenes meetings, and I do kind of indicate that maybe it's good to just look at that process to understand maybe why that invitation hasn't come to me, because none of these I have been formally invited to, so I cannot have missed them because I haven't been invited to them. Just want to make that clear to the public as well, because the things, and as well with the letters, thank you, it's a note here as well, we also realized in the discussions that we found the letters, some of the letters we have not received, they've now been found. Some of them were on our side, oversight, and we apologize for that, and they're currently being reviewed. So I think it's very important to be very cautious about how we put things out there sometimes, because invitations have not been sent and some documentation was not received. But for those that we have received and haven't responded to, we do apologize. And of course, responses are coming on that matter shortly. So with that, Madam Chair, I want to thank you for the opportunity, and of course, we will send the responses as requested within short. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Gums. We, the Secretariat and myself, look forward to receiving the answers that the Minister was going through today for this meeting as soon as possible. We understand where they're at now, and I will cut my sentence short here and allow MP Otley to make a very short statement, but I was closing off the meeting, at least adjourning the meeting. MP Otley, you may continue.
Good day, Minister. Minister, did you mention GB? Very important.
That should have come through me, but I'll allow the Minister to.
Minister,
Yes.
did you mention anything about the GB, the plans moving forward?
Minister, could you please respond to this, if you're able to at this time?
Of course, thank you, Madam Chair. Noting the Prime Minister's role in the ongoing GB discussions, I will, of course, ask that those questions be posed to the Prime Minister for the most up-to-date and thorough response on that matter.
Thank you, Minister Gums and members of Parliament. As we have agreed, the answers which the Minister started to give orally here will be sent in writing to Parliament. The minute these are received, they will be shared with members of Parliament. And of course, we'll keep you informed as to the continuation of this meeting, because this particular draft nature policy plan needs to be approved by the Parliament of St. Maarten as per the law, the applicable law. So, Minister, thank you. I will leave this meeting as being adjourned at this time until we finalize it and get the report that can then go to the public meeting on this proposal, on the proposal coming from the Central Committee. And I will allow, I hear MP Irian, but I see MP Doran. MP Doran, I allow you your statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want for clarity based on your last statement. So now we're going to adjourn while the minister sends the document for us to peruse it, and then we decide the way forward on the Central Committee meeting before we go to the OVA?
Yes.
So the meeting could continue after the fact once we consider the responses given.
Once we consider the responses, then it would be a little easier to determine whether we could have the continuation of this meeting and basically just finalize the report from the Central Committee and go. So we will be having the continuation of this meeting to decide whether more time is needed, or we will have the final report of the Central
that's what I
Committee
understand.
in that meeting documented and prepared for the public meeting. That is clear, and so again, thank you, Minister, and your support staff, members of Parliament, our support staff, all tuned into this meeting, and the Central Committee meeting on the Nature Policy Plan is hereby adjourned. Members will be receiving all of the answers as prepared by the Ministry within short. Meeting adjourned.